In the last video, we deal with Kant's approach, the first of the deontological approaches that we're going to deal with, and the main focus in this particular unit. But another one to be aware of is the rights-based approach. Now, why are we bringing this into the subject? Well, first off, you're not going to see Kant's approach used as explicitly as we teach it here. One of the reasons we do that is to give you a deeper understanding of the core concepts and also to make something more directly examinable. However, in business, what you will see referred to a lot is the idea of rights, like moral rights theory, which is very close to Kant's approach in a lot of ways. Why? Because it's based upon this idea that everyone has a duty, or this universal approach is required if we're going to deal ethically. So let's have a look at it. Now, while we talk about rights, generally a right brings with it a duty, right? You can't have a right without a duty because someone has a duty to provide the right. And when we have rights that are supported by law, they become legal rights as opposed to moral rights. So what we're going to deal with here is the idea of moral rights, and later in the unit we'll deal with some of these legal rights that we have. A core concept is this idea that moral rights are not exactly the same as legal rights. Hopefully there's a significant overlap, but they're not the same thing. We have these moral rights basically because we're humans, that all humans have these rights and that they are not granted by the state. We have them. To us, regardless of nationality, sex, national or ethnic origin, colour, religion, language, or any other status, they range from the most fundamental, the right to life, to those that make life worth living, such as the right to food, education, work, health, and liberty. So how do we know if something is a human right? Well, human rights are universal. So everyone, everywhere has them. Sound like someone we know? They're equal rights. No one has more than anyone else. No one has more of a right to life than anyone else. They are inalienable. You cannot give up any of these rights. Right? You can't sell the right. And they're natural rights. They don't depend on institutions. They don't depend on what the government, for instance, thinks, or what any church thinks, etc. They are natural rights. Probably the most well-known set of moral rights is the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so if we look at a part of that document, in specifically Article 32 of the rights, we can see some of the rights related to business. Everyone has the right to work, to choose where they're going to work, and to have just and favourable conditions of work, to be protected from unemployment. Everyone has the right to equal pay for equal work. Everyone has the right to just and favourable remuneration so that you have enough money for human dignity. Everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of their interests. So some pretty core concepts that are, in one way hard to argue with. Like, that seems quite reasonable. And the way that these rights operate is not so much that we have to do them, but we can't do things that break them. So we couldn't pay someone unjustly because that would be a breach of their human rights. So we have a duty to pay justly. So that's the way it works. It provides a constraint on what we can do. We can't take their life because they have a right to life. So really, the core problem with rights comes about in two forms. One is, where does this right come from? It suffers from the same problem that Kant was railing against with religion. It's a received wisdom. So what, if society decides that we have a new right, then that is a right? Or is there actually a human right that's inalienable and never changes, etc.? Interesting concept. Because if it's not a received wisdom that applies to all, then it actually is coming from an institution, right? How does society create the right? Through institutions. So the problem is, where does the right actually come from? The second thing is, what do we do when we have conflicting rights? Okay, so often the conflicting rights comes through in the idea of what are the boundaries of a specific right. If I want to reward someone fairly, remunerate them fairly, what's a fair remuneration? What the market will pay, or what you need to live, or what happens if I pay you? I don't have much money in my business, and if I pay you enough that you can live with dignity, but I can't. We now have conflicting rights in play. They're the kind of core ideas that are the problem with a rights-based approach. More generally, even if you accept rights, there's disagreements about the most fundamental of human rights. Okay, so things like abortion versus a right to life. There becomes a definition of what does a right to life mean? Does it include capital punishment? Does it include abortion? Where does life begin and where does life end? If we're talking about turning off machines in medicine, right? It actually gets quite complicated when you try to implement what seems like a very simple idea. Second problem that we have, human rights are sometimes justified as being self-evident, okay? But really that's a subjective test. What is self-evident to one person is not self-evident to another. What is self-evident today is not self-evident to 200 years ago. You're like, 2,000 years ago, it was self-evident the earth is flat. Is it self-evident that the earth is flat today? Probably not. That would mean that moral rights aren't unchanging and universal. Okay. And finally, we've got this problem of resolving conflicts. How do we resolve conflicts between moral rights? Okay, so that's the two key approaches to deontological ethics. We've just got one small section to go. Well, not small section, but one final section to go. A different way of looking at ethics, and that is a virtue-based approach to ethics, where we change the focus from focusing in on what an ethical person would do. Okay, so we're going to focus on making a decision based upon would an ethical person do this, rather than whether it was an ethical act or decision. Subtle change there. And that'll be in our next little video.